Coming up on today's episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin, Project Talk. Got a charity? Have some Bitcoins. Turk.co's free WordPress tip jar plugin. And Bitcoin Press Center up to 22 languages. Interview with Charles Hoskinson, founder of the Bitcoin Education Project, as they roll out their new effort. Bitcoin Neutrality, looking ahead to not trap innovation with the limitations we have now. Open transactions in BitMessage. I interview Chris, better known as Fellow Traveler, on the intricacies of this new system. Microtransactions versus BitDust, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And finally, my wide-ranging interview with Mark Hochstein, editor of American Banker, and Bailey Reitzel of Payment Source, during which we cover Bitcoin's compatibility with the existing financial system, the journey of journalism, and how everything old really is new again. Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a twice-weekly show focused on the ideas, projects, and people building the new digital economy and the future of money. If you're brand new to Bitcoin and would like to learn more, please visit www.letstalkbitcoin.com/learn to be directed to the Bitcoin Education Project. My name is Adam B. Levine. I'm a writer and speaker who likes to talk about complicated topics in understandable terms. Joining me in our twice-weekly search for clarity, Andreas M. Antonopoulos is an expert in distributed systems and decentralized networks.
Hi, everyone.
Dr. Stephanie Murphy is a scientist and syndicated radio host.
Hi.
We've skipped Project Talk for the last couple of episodes when we were going in, and I know that we just have a jam-packed episode again today with Fellow Traveler coming up later to talk about open transactions in BitMessage, but I know that there are a couple of projects that we'd like to get to, so Stephanie, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, I wanted to really highlight something that I think is a super cool project. It's not my project, but I did meet one of the people behind this project at the Bitcoin conference, and that was Raza. He also posts as Raza on the Bitcoin Talk forum. And the project is called Bitcoin 100. An organization that's designed to help nonprofit entities and charities accept Bitcoin. So what they will do for a nonprofit is set them up with a wallet, a Bitcoin wallet, show them how to use Bitcoin, and then start them off with $1,000 worth of Bitcoin donations. The reason they were called Bitcoin 100 initially was because they formed when Bitcoins were worth around $10 each. And so they were starting charities off with 100 Bitcoins of donations in the past, but then they changed it to $1,000, which right now is around 8 Bitcoins or something like that. So I just think this is really cool. They've already highlighted some charities that they've helped accept Bitcoins. They actually just helped out Free Aid. And of course, Free Aid was accepting Bitcoins before we met them, and we were a primarily Bitcoin-based charity before we ran into Bitcoin 100. But they just helped Free Aid out with a nice donation, and so we really thank them for that. But they haven't had enough takers. Frankly, they still have quite a large fund that they want to use to help nonprofit organizations get started with Bitcoin. So if you have a nonprofit or a charity, this is, of course, something that's very important to me, as I've talked about being involved with Free Aid, the charity, earlier on the show. If you have a nonprofit or a charity organization that you want to help get started with Bitcoins and start them off with a nice donation, please get in touch with them. Their website is bitcoin100.org, and you can find out more about them there.
One of the areas that I really have been focusing on is helping people to monetize original content that they make on the internet, make and release on the internet, and it's hard to get paid to do that. So I gave a talk about this at Bitcoin 2013 in San Jose. As a result of that, there have been a number of projects that sprung up, but one of the ones that's really far along actually is a WordPress plugin that is already functional, completely free, and that essentially automates the process of creating and displaying and explaining a tip widget or tip address for every single post that you make, so that you can have readers and listeners or whatever your type of content is donate to support specific pieces they like, rather than just putting up a donation thing that that just goes to you. They can say, this is something that I want to reward. And so that's something that's actually available now. You can go and download that for free at terk.co. That's turk.co, which is the screen name of the developer who has designed this plugin, actually. If you're in the content creation industry, I recommend you check it out, turk.co.
That sounds really useful. And as you were talking about that, Adam, I kind of had the thought pop up that this brings up a philosophical issue about tips. Tips are meant to be this market mechanism by which you provide feedback about somebody's service that they've given you, right? To a server at a restaurant or something like that. If they're a great server, you're supposed to give them a bigger tip. And if they're not so great, you can give them a small tip. But tips are really not that effective for communicating that in the world that we live in now. It's like, you're kind of supposed to give a 15% tip at a restaurant or even 20%. And if you don't give that high of a tip, they don't know why. The server has no idea why, unless you communicate about it and write on your bill, I would have liked to give you a bigger tip, but you didn't do this or whatever. And so I think maybe an app like this could really help people get more precise feedback about why they are or are not getting tips. Maybe not where they're not getting tips, but certainly why they are, because you could tip a very specific thing.
You've identified a real core point here, and also the problem with tips, which I totally agree with. When I go into a restaurant, it's totally expected that you tip no matter what the service is, not because that's what, the person wants to be tipped. They're like, oh, well, you have to tip me. No, because that's built into the earning assumption. It's built in that, yes, you're going to, as a, server in this type of role, receive such and such percentage of your income from tips. And so they're paid less because of that. So, on the internet, it's kind of the opposite thing. On the internet, nobody's paid. And so it's like the exception if you are paid at all. So tips have a much higher disproportionate effect relative to how large they are in terms of being able to impact behavior. So no, I think it's great. And it really is it's a tool for content creators. And it's not just content creators either. I talked with the woman who runs antiwar.com. And it's the same thing. They produce original content, and they're creating content, but ultimately it's creating content with an ideological bent that reports it in a specific way. And so it's less about the specific news item and more about the fact that they're reporting on it. More about the fact that people appreciate the perspective that they're bringing. So again, they haven't implemented this yet, but I think that they're a really clean use scenario for this, where it's not really just about rewarding content creation so much as it is about rewarding doing the thing in general and providing feedback.
I think if you sit down and watch a piece of content with more than 6 people, the tip widget should automatically count an 18% tip and display it for you. Just kidding. But the logistics behind this are quite tricky. We realized that with Let's Talk Bitcoin. Just creating addresses and then being able to meaningfully correlate and consume the data flow that comes back, the analytics of which pieces of content are doing well and which are not. And then being able to correlate, that with security settings and things like that, because it's fairly easy for someone to go and inject their own address into somebody else's content and then basically divert the stream of tips to themselves. So you have to have some security procedures to watch for that. It's a lot more than just putting a tip jar up there. You have to think about all of the logistics behind the scenes, which is why these widgets are very interesting and I think very valuable developments. That's
something that we have not really addressed in the show. You're right. These things can be hijacked. We haven't actually had a problem with that yet. And I think that we're kind of at the forefront of trying this technology. So talking about this sort of invites it. I'm curious to see if there are any problems. We're at such a nascent part of the development of all of this technology that all of these mistakes are really easy to make. And so it's interesting to see which ones wind up actually being problems and which ones are just technically possible problems.
Yeah, one of the nice things about the internet and doing this on the internet is that you can monitor the tip addresses that are associated with certain pieces of content remotely. So you can have a separate service that watches if the tip address has changed and notifies you. So even if someone is able to completely hijack a site and inject tip addresses, they would have to hijack this completely separate service that monitors. At least that's the approach we're taking to monitoring tip addresses externally to make sure they haven't been hijacked.
Giving away the business model there, Andreas, aren't you?
No, I think security advice should be shared broadly because I think other businesses are going to run into this problem. And the last thing we want to see is people not trusting tips because... but yeah, I did give away the business model there.
That's okay. That seems to be what we do here.
I open sourced it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Andreas, do you have a project you want to talk about today?
I would love to talk about the bitcoinpresscenter.org site. Bitcoinpresscenter.org is a site that I built as part of Route 11, my company, a couple of months ago, and maybe not even that long, a month and a half ago. And what it does is it presents a place for journalists in radio, print, TV to be able to find Bitcoin experts who can comment about Bitcoin stories, can provide quotes, can be interviewed for stories. The key thing about bitcoinpresscenter.org is that it is global from the get-go. We now have almost 60 press contacts speaking 22 different languages. The entire site is geared towards finding the exact right person. So you can slice and dice and find specific countries, time zones, languages, or even areas of expertise. If you want someone who is an expert in economics or software or hardware, or if you want someone who has experience as a miner or merchant or user of the currency. And then, you can narrow it down. If you want to find a California expert who speaks Farsi, who is an expert in the software side of things, you can find him. And so we invite people to come and nominate experts who speak their language. Please visit bitcoinpresscenter.org and add as many contacts as you think are appropriate who can speak to the media intelligently about Bitcoin. It's an open and inclusive platform, and the more people we have and the more rich metadata we have, the better.
Looks pretty good, too. I just updated my profile last night, actually.
Well, it's very focused, and I think that's the key. It's not a generic site. It's absolutely about Bitcoin and focused on Bitcoin, so it's very easy to highlight, really show the skills in that specific area that you have.
I'm really pleased today to be joined by Charles Hoskinson. Charles has been running the Bitcoin Education Project for about a month now, and he's got some pretty exciting announcements to make. So, Charles, why don't you explain what we're talking about here?
The Bitcoin Education Project is something we started about a month ago, and its flagship product was a Udemy course named Bitcoin, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Crypto. And after I launched it, I realized there was a lot of people in the community who really enjoy teaching about Bitcoin, and they want to contribute maybe a small piece of content or do a lecture series. And so I said, gosh, it'd be a really nice thing to do to aggregate all of them into a central project. And so that's what the Bitcoin Education Project is all about. So over the last few weeks, what I've been doing is building the website, talking to people, recruiting fellows, and I'm pleased to announce today our official relaunch to public on Let's Talk Bitcoin for the Bitcoin Education Project. Our goal is to build peer-reviewed, free content for public release, both commercial and for personal use, with the end goal of using this content to bring 1 million active, engaged users into the Bitcoin ecosystem.
That's a pretty ambitious goal there.
Right, yeah, and by the end of 2014, I should say. How we're going to accomplish this is first using our flagship course, the Bitcoin course I just mentioned, and then 2 other courses that we're building over the summer. So one class is going to be Bitcoin for computer scientists, and that course is going to be specifically for graduate level professionals. So people who are in a master's program or a PhD program, or somebody who's in industry with 3 or 4 years of experience in peer-to-peer networks and cryptography. The goal there is to actually annotate the entire Satoshi protocol. So we're going to, just kind of like what Charles Petzel did with the annotated Turing, we're going to open up Satoshi's white paper and go through section by section and discuss what did Satoshi say, what ended up getting implemented, and where is this going. And then also we're going to have some lectures on cryptography and some lectures on peer-to-peer networks and so forth. The goal for this class is to kind of spur adoption in the computer science departments of universities so active research can be done, and also to encourage people to begin working on the Bitcoin protocol and actually collaborate with the project. The third course is going to be Bitcoin for business professionals. It's kind of a Bitcoin for entrepreneur course. One of the things I've gotten now that we've had our first course out for about a month, we have 1,800 students so far, is I've gotten a huge amount of feedback from people in the community about they don't understand the regulations, the laws. If their business was to accept Bitcoins, what do they have to worry about? And those are very valid and very good questions, and they should be addressed thoroughly and accurately. And so we're going to launch a third course over the summer, Bitcoin for business professionals, and that course is going to focus on what are the tax laws, what are the regulations. If you're going to use Bitcoins, how do you record them in your books? And also we're going to use that course as an expose for a lot of merchant services that exist for Bitcoin. For example, if you want to accept Bitcoin through BitPay, how do you actually do that? How do you integrate that into your website? So those are the 3 pieces of content that we intend on producing throughout the summer, and we're going to market it heavily and refine it, update it, and build it in a very collaborative way. And our goal is to use that content to bring 1 million people by the end of 2014 into Bitcoin.
So the education problem is one you're obviously really familiar with. What do you think people have the most trouble grasping?
Terminology is probably the first big issue. People have no idea what a blockchain is or a block. The cryptographic concepts are also very difficult. It really depends upon the particular person, where the person's coming from. So for businesses, really what's vexing them, they really don't have any idea what the laws are with Bitcoin. They don't really have any idea what the regulations are, what forms they have to file, what people they have to talk to, how long they should hold the Bitcoins, where they can liquidate the Bitcoins for US dollars or euros. And actually what makes this problem even more complex is that business is international, and so regulations and laws are different in every single country. So you could be in compliance in America, for example, but then all of a sudden be out of compliance in Europe. And so that's something from the business side that we very commonly get a lot of questions about. For general consumers, a lot of questions usually come of why do they have any value whatsoever? Why does a Bitcoin, why is it worth anything? Which is actually a very good question, and we try to answer it as best we can in our first course, Bitcoin, or How We Learn to Stop Worrying and Love Crypto. And we also get a lot of questions about how do I securely use Bitcoin? That's something that people are always concerned about, because we always tell people, hey, these transactions are irreversible. If you're not careful, people can steal your private keys through social engineering or through bugs in software and so forth. So there's a certain degree of competency that you have to have, and it does scare average everyday users. And so that's one of the things that we get often, and we try to answer. There is no silver bullet for what people tend to ask. It's kind of a spectrum of questions, and that's why we're releasing a series of 3 classes, because we're trying to cover as broad of a base as possible, because the questions that computer scientists are going to ask are going to be much more sophisticated and in-depth than, let's say, your grandmother would ask about Bitcoin, but they're both equally valid. We need both groups of people in the ecosystem if the ecosystem is going to survive.
And it seems like with your annotated Satoshi line that you're not only trying to give the technical background, but also kind of the contextual background to what was being thought at the time that this was being created.
Right, and actually it's a very valid and valuable thing to do from an academic standpoint, because the white paper was really saying these are some problems I would like to resolve, and here is the implementation I have chosen to resolve these problems. And so if you understand it from that lens, you may have certain knowledge domains that would be able to better resolve the problems in the way the protocol has. For a good example would be the proof of work that we currently deploy with Bitcoin. It does resolve 2 big problems. Number 1, how do you verify transactions? And number 2, how do you go ahead and distribute money? The big problem with the proof of work is that while it accomplishes both of those features, the computations are kind of thrown away. They're not socially beneficial in any sense of the way. If one, for example, could find a way to accomplish both things, verify transactions and allow more money to enter the ecosystem in a fair way, but at the same time, let's say maybe integrate folding at home, or the SETI project into the proof of work, then all of a sudden you're not only making Bitcoins, but you're also doing something socially beneficial with the mining process. So this is an example of where the annotated Satoshi line can take us. It allows a very diverse group of people from across the academic and professional spectrum to take a look at the protocol, where it stands, what's been done, and what are the problems they're trying to resolve. It gives them the context they need to take their own experiences and their own solutions and their own ideas into the ecosystem. And maybe it'll mean improving the protocol itself, or maybe it will mean the development of alternative currencies that are superior. But that's kind of the hope, is that we want to spur that conversation. We want peer-reviewed research to start being produced in computer science departments that can help us grow Bitcoin to meet the challenges of the future.
Both Andreas and I have gotten involved as fellows who will be giving lectures for the project. How can interested people get involved?
Oh, absolutely. So we're currently looking for 3 groups of help. First, you can volunteer for the project, either your time, market the project, help us with fundraising, or even produce content. The best way of getting in contact with us is my email, charles.hoskinson@gmail.com. Or you can go to our website, btcedproject.org. So Barry, Tony, Charlie, Ed, Derek, project.org. And that's kind of a nice centralized effort where you can see what we're working on and what we're doing. And there are numerous links to contact us there, either securely with PGP or just via email. So if you'd like to volunteer, we'd love to have you, regardless of if you're a newbie or if you're a veteran in the community. The other 2 things you can definitely do to help the project. One would be to donate to the project. We're starting a fundraising campaign, doing things like paying a lawyer to figure out what the regulations are in America, or working with computer scientists to actually go through source code and deal with the protocol are not free. No matter how many volunteers you get, you have to pay people at some point. So we're starting a donation drive to help cover some of those expenses. And that's going to be 100 Bitcoins in 30 days. So our donation address will be in the show notes, and it's also on our website. So you can definitely donate to the project, and we'd love for you to do that. And finally, the last thing you can do is tell your friends and family. If you like Bitcoin and you want to tell them about Bitcoin, instead of having to sit down and explain it over the kitchen room table, you can now just give them our Udemy link. And if they take our course, we think that it'll really help them get to where they need to go, and hopefully evangelize them enough to actually spread the message amongst their friends and family.
Well, thanks very much for doing this important work, Charles, and thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Everyone knows that offline storage is the only safe way to store your Bitcoins. Now there's an easy, convenient, and secure way to make Bitcoin wallets for safe offline storage. With the Safe Paper Wallet Kit, you get everything you need to print Bitcoin wallets using your own PC. Store them in a safe deposit box, your home safe, or even your sock drawer. Anything's more secure than keeping them online. Get your kit now at safepaperwallet.com.
You're listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin, the premier audiocast providing news and insights that cover the rapidly evolving world of digital money. Our twice-weekly shows include analysis of late-breaking news, updates on key technical, business, and regulatory issues, and in-depth interviews with the key people driving the new digital economy. Let's Talk Bitcoin offers sponsors an attractive way to reach a targeted and savvy audience. For more information, email sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.
This is a topic that's very close to my heart, and it's the topic of Bitcoin neutrality. It takes a bit of explanation to explain what Bitcoin neutrality is, but simply enough, it is the exact same concept that we've been living on the internet for the past 2 decades. And fortunately, on the internet, we've been able to both express that principle and implement it and preserve it against attempts to break it down. So Bitcoin neutrality is the concept that Bitcoin as a platform should be neutral and be able to carry any type of payment content from any payment initiator to any payee, regardless of who the origins are, who the destinations are, their size, or anything else, and simply carry the payment, if it's paid for with fees, neutrally. There's other aspects to Bitcoin neutrality, but that's the basic one, which means empower the endpoints, make the network itself as neutral as possible, able to carry whatever people may come up with. It's important because it recognizes that Bitcoin is a platform and a protocol that other things will be built on top of it, rather than Bitcoin being seen as a payment system that is essentially done, complete, and we're optimizing it as a payment system. Because if you try to optimize it, you end up making it less neutral. Whereas if you see it as a platform, then you build other things on top of it that are more specialized.
It's a question of specificity, right? So when we talk about optimizing things, optimizing doesn't mean you go through and you pick all of the most efficient practices. Optimizing means you go through, you determine what the end result is that you're trying to accomplish, and then you pick all of the methods and practices that accomplish that goal. So I think emphasizing that Bitcoin is a platform rather than an end in and of itself is really important here, because it means that you can't optimize it. It means that the way to optimize it is to be as inclusive as possible so that you can support as many business models, as many different uses and types of things that people want to do with it, instead of trying to figure out how to specifically streamline it for this one use that you had in mind at the beginning.
There is definitely room for specialized uses of Bitcoin as a system, and for sort of division of labor for some people to use Bitcoin for specific purposes at specific times, as long as those uses don't prohibit other uses or don't impinge on other uses, as long as it remains that Bitcoin is a diverse tool that's decentralized that can be used for potentially a lot of different purposes depending on what the individual user wants.
Really, being able to preserve Bitcoin as a platform recognizes essentially the individual components of Bitcoin as having tremendous innovation value themselves. So this is about saying what should go in the blockchain, What types of transactions do we want to enable? And how do you deal with thorny issues of contention around use of the blockchain as they arise? So, for example, we already have some issues that are quite controversial around unspendable or not provably unspendable outputs. Basically outputs that can't be reused because they're too small, or outputs that go to addresses that nobody has the keys for. Essentially, they're throwaway money. If you don't know that they're throwaway money, they just sit around in the blockchain forever. Whereas if you knew that those addresses could not be spent, you can actually prune some of them while still keeping the fact that they entered the blockchain. Those are some of the issues that the developers are dealing with right now. It also ties into issues around the size of the blockchain, around the propagation of messages on the peer-to-peer network, etc. And the choices we make now will affect how open and flexible Bitcoin, the protocol, Bitcoin, the platform, the blockchain, will be to future uses that we can't even imagine. Think if the early internet people said, email is the predominant use, text is what people are going to be using. Let's make it very, very friendly to text and not particularly friendly to voice and video. We wouldn't have many of the applications we really cherish today.
That's a really important point to bring up, because we don't really know exactly what the shape of Bitcoin is going to be in the future, and there needs to be room for all kinds of innovation to happen. And that means really no specific individual or group of individuals should be making top-down decisions about what the right or correct or optimal use of Bitcoin actually is. There needs to be the freedom for all kinds of different uses to be acceptable, okay. And, people may have individual judgments about things like throwaway addresses or about things like bit dust or anything like that. But it's really important to, I guess, give those at least the space to exist, even if you personally would not use Bitcoin in that way. It's just like freedom in the rest of life. Other people sort of need to have the liberty to live their lives as they choose and as they see fit, without anybody else sort of managing what they do in order to have a free society.
This project and this problem seem to be tied a lot around the idea that some of these functions can't be done on another blockchain besides the Bitcoin blockchain. So I'm curious for what everybody thinks about that. I mean, like, if you were to take an application like Satoshi Dice and create, Satoshi coin or Dice coin or whatever you wanted to call it, and it was essentially the same thing, except instead of going onto the blockchain with everybody else, it used its own blockchain and was, for its own purpose, or like data stamp coin or something like that, because those are the primary things that people are having problems with. Like the notary service we talked about in the last episode, ultimately creates irredeemable transactions that are broken intentionally so that they put this incorrect information that serves the purpose that it wants to serve, which is verifying that this particular document was, verified and put into the blockchain at this point in time. So could you have like a alt use chain that does all the same stuff as Bitcoin but runs on a parallel process? I mean, would that still work in the same way, or does that lose something?
That loses a great deal. The blockchain really is two things. It's a tremendously useful technology, but it's also a very distributed and very broadly distributed data set. So part of the advantage of being on the Bitcoin blockchain is that because people also use it for payments, it's very widely distributed, very carefully checked. It has a massive amount of hashing power behind it to verify it. If you go on another network, you're doing two things. First of all, you're creating two different silos. So you're moving in the opposite direction of a platform. It's a bit like saying, well, IP is not so suitable for video, so let's build a parallel network to the internet. And, don't think that the telecoms didn't try to do that. They absolutely did. We're first with ATM, the protocol, asynchronous transfer modes, cell-based networks, instead of packet-based networks, cell switch networks, and also SONET fiber optics networks. And all of those failed. And they failed because the value of decentralization trumps the special use case. It's much better to have one common neutral network that everyone can play on, because that increases the network effect. If you put your transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain, that gives you the certainty that it's going to be very widely distributed and guaranteed with a lot of hashing power. The real question is, can you do that without bloating the blockchain and without creating too much processing on the end nodes, which tend to be pretty small and increasingly mobile. That's the real issue here. And I think the developers are already discussing that. The issue is not unspendable transactions. It's rather provably unspendable transactions. If you send transactions to addresses that everyone can verify don't have private keys or are bogus, that's okay, because no one's then going to try and spend those or doesn't need to keep a record of them. The problem is when you don't know if the transaction can be spent or not, so you keep it around forever in the UTXO pool.
Andreas, can you please explain who actually sees this UXTO pool that we've been talking about? Because that's a little abstract.
UTXO is the unspent transaction outputs. Think of it this way. Every time you want to create a new transaction, what you do is you take all of the unspent transactions you have in your wallet, and then you bundle them together to get the right amount or more than the right amount that you're going to spend, send that to the payee, and then also have some change coming back to you if it's more than the amount. If you have to use lots of tiny ones, that makes a very big transaction. The UTXO pool is shared and essentially constructed dynamically, from what I understand, from the blockchain. So if you traverse the entire blockchain, you can find all of the unspent transactions. And by keeping that in memory, you can immediately verify if a payment has the correct unspent transactions in it. And if I understand also, it's done with a Merkle tree, which makes it easier to prune off entire segments of that tree and only keep their hash. Essentially, it's like cutting off the branch of the tree, but knowing that it was there because the stump of the branch still gives you an idea of how big that branch was. And you know what was there before without having to verify every single part of it. So really, this is a global database. If you have a lot of stuff that's in there but really can't be used by anyone, it just makes the size of the database larger without being useful. The unspent transactions. And you keep it there so that you could potentially spend it in the future. And that just keeps increasing the size of the pool.
They're talking about setting up disincentives, things that make it so you wouldn't want to do these transactions that are not the intended quote-unquote use, which is sending value with Bitcoin. What if a modification was made to the protocol that made it so there was a checkbox that you could check that says this is a other use transaction, and it makes it so it's provably unspendable, so because it's not intended to be spent. Would that be a potential solution to this problem, or do you think that it just needs to be completely left alone and all of these things are just further making it worse?
I think that's exactly the discussion that's happening right now, which is the combination of how do you manage the blockchain size and how do you manage the UTXO pool, the unspent transaction outputs, that needs to be at least maintained at a reasonable level and not bloat with things that everyone knows are useless but can't really prove they're useless.
I have a question. Bloat is a relative term, right? It's subjective. It's according to somebody's opinion. And so I'm just wondering, what are the criteria for a bloated blockchain, and what would be, quote, too many in the UTXO pool?
So I would say there's a very big distinction between the two. I think you can't really talk about bloat in the blockchain because that really is a completely subjective criterion. However, if a transaction is not spendable, then holding it in the unspent transaction output pool is pointless. So that is bloat. I mean, it really has no functional use to be in the unspent transaction output pool, because the only reason for being in there is so that someone can spend it, right? And if you know it can't be spent, it's just sitting there for no reason. It will never be spent practically, and therefore it's never going to go away. That is a technical problem. There's no downside to not having those transactions in the pool. They'll still be in the blockchain. They'll be recognized as having been created. You're just recognizing the fact that they're no longer spendable, and therefore you don't need to keep the actual output around for future spending. And the discussion right now is, how do you mark them, or what transaction script can you create that makes that a provably unspendable output, so you can simply include it in the blockchain as a proof of existence and then discard the output because it can't be spent.
So I'm joined by a fellow traveler. Chris, there's been a lot of talk recently about open transactions and BitMessage. Before we get into that, can you give us just kind of the, from 10,000 feet, what is open transactions?
Open transactions is an open source financial cryptography library, which is available in many different languages. It's written in C++, but you can use it from Python or whatever.
Okay, so what does that mean?
At the base level, it's just a library that does financial cryptography operations. And then using that library, I built a server, a client API. What you're able to do is you're able to connect to these servers and issue currencies, open accounts, withdraw cash, write checks, trade on markets, just all kinds of different financial operations can be achieved through the open transaction system.
The open transaction system, one of its functions is as a decentralized market, which is also the same as a decentralized exchange, right?
No, not exactly, because each server contains a market, or actually a set of markets, depending on the different currencies that are being traded there. So, for example, you could connect to a specific server and trade one currency for another currency. You could say, I'm going to sell some gold to buy Bitcoins with, or whatever the currencies are that are issued there. The big problem that we had, if you want to have a distributed exchange, you want to be able to have trades that go across servers. Any two people can trade on a specific server if they're able to discover each other and find the server that they're going to agree to meet on and perform a trade at. But let's say that there's 100 servers or 1,000 servers out there. These people aren't necessarily on the same server. And so that's what BitMessage solved. BitMessage became a P2P discovery layer that we could use for anyone to discover other users who might be on different servers so that they can find a common server to meet on and do trades on.
Is it the broadcast feature? We've been playing around with BitMessage on the show, and one of the things that we've been looking at, of course, is the broadcast feature. We're thinking about it for newsletters, but I'm thinking, based on the problem you're talking about, which is a bunch of different servers running markets that are owned by different people who don't necessarily know each other, they still need to be able to find each other in order for the market to be frictionless, so to speak.
That's exactly it. It's the broadcast feature.
What does that mean? Since this has happened, what's the next step in this thought process?
With BitMessage, and this is just one discovery layer. I really like it because we played around with it and proved that we could use it and that it would work. But technically, you could swap it out and use any other discovery layer as well. But this is going to be the first implementation is going to be with BitMessage. And with BitMessage, what you can do is you can sort of name a channel. Like imagine on IRC, if you say, I'm going to get on the Bitcoin channel, and then anyone else who gets on the Bitcoin channel, they meet you there and they're all able to send messages to each other. It's sort of like that with BitMessage. With BitMessage, you can name a channel. You can say like, I want to meet on the Bitcoin channel, and anyone else who's listening to that same channel will see your broadcasts. And so what I'm able to do is, for example, let's say that I want to trade gold for silver. Now, in open transactions, each asset type has an ID. It kind of looks like a Bitcoin address or something like that. It's just this long hash base 62 ID. And so what you can do is you can take, say, the gold ID and the silver ID and then XOR them together. So an XOR process is just a crypto process that sort of combines them to create this new ID that's a combination of the two. And then I use that as my broadcast channel. So anyone else who's interested in gold and silver will be listening to that same channel. And so then when I say, hey, I want to trade gold for silver, and I'm willing to pay this much, or I have this much for sale, and I'm on this server, then anyone else can then connect to that server and trade with me there. So it just gives us a way to sort of discover each other.
So this is like BitMessage addresses as deterministic, right? That's what you're doing here. You're taking essentially combinations of names that are then turned into these addresses that are then used as broadcast channels, because anybody who's turning those two particular things into this, into this BitMessage address name is going to find the same thing that the person who's doing it originally did. Is that right?
That is exactly right. And I'll give you another example. Let's say that it wasn't cross-server trading. Let's say that it was a wire. Because you can use this for different things. Let's say I want to wire some funds from server A to server B. For example, let's say I want to wire some gold from server A to server B. Mm-hmm. So I take the gold ID, the server A ID, and the server B ID, and XOR them together. and then broadcast on that channel. And then anyone else who's willing to perform such wires, anyone else who has an account on both servers, and he's willing to do it for whatever fee that I'm willing to pay, then he can reply back and say, hey, I'll do it. And then I give him some money on server A, and he gives me some money on server B. And we're able to negotiate that process using escrow on OT, where server A keeps it in escrow, and then server B goes into escrow and that sort of thing.
That sounds pretty good. That sounds like a really innovative use. You're not so there hasn't been a specific client developed to do this yet, has there? Or is that what your proof of concept is?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, I just proposed this a couple days ago.
Right. So
we were playing around with BitMessage, and this is kind of on a lark. I mean, this is something that was coming someday, and I've written on my wiki about how this sort of thing is coming someday. We just happen to be messing around with BitMessage, and we're like, hey, we can do server wires with this. We can do cross-server trading with this. Let's write this up. So I wrote up the protocols, the sort of a basic write-up of what the protocols would be, and posted on the Bitcoin forum, and it really caused a splash, which is a little surprising to me in a sense because, I have said on my wiki that this is coming for a long time.
Well, I think that the topic is pretty sensitive right now because of all of the concerns about exchanges, and people view open transactions in the same way they view Ripple, which is a way to move away from the transactions happening on these centralized servers like Mt. Gox. I mean, there's a lot of concern in the community about that. So, you've been working on open transactions now for 2 years?
I started in the beginning of 2010, so
3 years.
We're now in 3.5 years.
3.5 years. How significant is this? Does this impact the development schedule? Does it, is there a time frame on open transactions at this point that is even reasonable to talk about?
Well, I mean, the BitMessage integration has to be coded. I couldn't give a time frame on that. I can say that it's definitely on the horizon now that we've figured out how it will be done. I can't say exactly how long it would be.
Mm-hmm. There are already servers that are running open transactions, so it's out there in the wild. Are people actually using it for the purpose as intended, or is it more just kind of proof of concept installations at this point?
I would say it's proof of concept installations. There are places where it's being used, but it's not in common use, and the reason for that is because there's not a really easy client yet for people to use. Basically, everyone could use it right now if they want to use the command line.
Right.
Or if they want to use the ugly Java test GUI, which is really just for developers. Now I do have nicer GUIs coming. What I did was for a couple years I just focused on the core, the engine, the scripting, the command line, because I figure I'm going to give everybody else a head start to make clients. The library itself is already a full-time job, and so I figured, I'll just make this library and focus on this library. And then everyone else has the opportunity to get a head start and make the clients that people can use, and they can sort of own their own projects, And now what's going on is my company, we started a company, Monetos, and we've started to get funding. And so we've started implementing commercial clients, like an iPhone app, Android app, desktop app, this kind of thing. And so it could be that I'm going to end up having the first clients myself. I could say that iPhone app will probably be working in another couple weeks. I don't know if I would stick it up in the App Store yet, but I'll be able to demonstrate it to people.
As an open source project that is kind of on the bleeding edge of this monetary transactions tech, it's basically you and Ripple taking a shot at this space. I'm curious, you're saying that no one has developed a client for open transactions and that you might be the first one out even 3.5 years later. So I'm wondering, were you expecting more support? Has there been much support from other people who want to develop on top of it?
Well, I can say that there's definitely been a lot of participation from the open source community. There has not been anyone who has jumped forward and said, I'm going to write some badass client. Of course, I have to be fair and say that what's easy for me is not necessarily easy for others. When I first released the project, there was only a very low-level API, which seemed easy enough to me, but everyone else thought it was pretty damn complicated. And so then I said, fair enough, and I started working on a really high-level API, which we have now. We have a really high-level API. And I think it would be much easier for someone now to write an open transactions client. It's certainly been very easy for me to slap together an iPhone app. I would say that a lot of the contributions that we've had, and we have had a lot of contributions, has been more on the back-end side, like testers. There's a guy who volunteered to build the Linux tarball, the build system. The build system that we have now came from volunteers. And there's a lot of stuff in there like that I don't even understand. I don't understand how these auto tools build systems work, but these contributors came on and got it all put together, and there it is.
So outside of the client, what's kind of next? You've formed a company, Monetos, and you've sought funding. So what's the funding going towards? Is this going to become your full-time job? Is it already?
Yeah, it's already my full-time job and has been since late last year, mid last year. We're making a iPhone app, and then, like I said, I should be able to demonstrate that to people that it's working within maybe another week or two. And then a lot of the code that's in the iPhone app is going to go right on over into the Android app. And the Android app is actually much more important than the iPhone app. You make the iPhone app first because all the investors have iPhones. But what you're really aiming for is the Android app because everyone in Africa is going to have Android.
Well, Chris, we're going to have you back on once the iPhone app is working, and we can kind of take a look at that and see how it works in real life. If you'd like to learn more about open transactions, visit letstalkbitcoin.com/OT.
And we've also got an IRC channel on Freenode, irc.freenode.net. There's a open transactions channel with no dash in it. And there's 54 people logged in there right now.
Well, thank you for your time, Chris. We'll look forward to having you back on.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I'm really curious about disincentives, right? Because this is like making it less attractive to do these things and having it only apply to transactions that we don't like, and when I say we, I mean the network, relative to transactions that are just normal transactions. Can you think of any ways where you could implement disincentives or even be able to tell one of these good transactions from one of these bad transactions without having a net negative effect on the network?
Yes, absolutely. I think the issue here is a matter of timing. So the long-term plan, as far as I understand it from the discussions among developers that I follow, is to effectively have an efficient market in process for the mining that allows transactions to be included based on the fees, and to streamline that so that the market efficiencies make that decision. Really what we were talking about in the previous episode, which is just let the market decide, and if you have value associated or a fee associated with it, it's good enough to go in the blockchain. At the moment, there is no market mechanism. So what's happening is until that market mechanism is built, you have the problem of what do you do in the meantime. Separately, there's this issue of can you at least flag these transactions so they don't need to go into the UTXO where they're really not necessary. And everyone agrees on that. That's not a subjective issue. Unspendable transactions don't need to be in the UTXO. So the question is, how do you get from here to a future where you have a market system without blowing up the network in the meantime? And I think the idea that's being discussed a lot right now to create temporary disincentives or to balance things more towards payments for now, while at the same time moving towards a market model that is more neutral and is based purely on value, and that correctly bring these externalities back into the price. I think that's the real issue. Markets fail when they have externalities. If you can take a vat of sulfuric acid and dump it in the river, and it costs you less than processing that cleanly, and everybody else suffers because of that, but you don't really pay a price, that's an externality. Similarly, if you can price these externalities back into the market function, then you really don't need to worry about them because they then become part of the market. Until that happens, you need some basic disincentives. So that's really the discussion going on right now. And I'm interested in this discussion because I think that net neutrality for Bitcoin is basically on the chopping block right now. It's the topic that's affected most by the decisions that are made in the next few months, in the next year, as to how these things are handled.
It sounds like what you're telling me here is that, again, trying to think about ways that these disincentives could work, the only thing that I can really think of is increasing the transaction fees, right? Because you're saying there's no market mechanism for setting these right now, so they can't properly value them. To increase the disincentives for smaller transactions, that means that you have to raise the relative price of each smaller transaction, which means you have to raise the transaction fee, right?
that's already happened, not in necessarily raising the transaction fee, but making it so that as a first step, miners can programmatically set their minimum fees and some recommendations about what those minimum fees should be, while at the same time keeping the growth of the blockchain, the maximum block size, increasing in a more controlled fashion. That creates market pressure in itself to only include transactions that pay enough to be worth it. So it's decreasing the supply of space in the blockchain by artificially constraining the size of blocks, the top end, which we've been doing all along. And that puts a premium on transaction size, which then influences the miners into making choices about what transactions they put in. So it's beginning to bring some of these things in, but not in a very market efficient manner. Fortunately, this is clearly seen as an interim step by everyone involved. The long-term goal is to make this a market mechanism.
Hold on a minute, though, because as I understand it, the block size right now of 1 megabyte is not being hit. It's not inhibiting any transactions from being included right now. It may in the future, but not right now. Also, another point, there's a big difference between building into the code an increased transaction fee, sort of a central way of raising the transaction fees, versus letting the miners set their own minimum transaction fee that they're going to include in their blocks. I think that's a lot more decentralized mechanism.
At the moment, we don't know what the outcome will be. There's pressure, even if we're not hitting the maximum block size. You have to imagine that a lot of that is essentially self-regulation by the miners. Knowing that the maximum is there makes you more selectively pick transactions or put settings that more selectively pick transactions. And at the moment, it's not a problem, but I think that in turn is constraining people generating transactions, because they know that if they try and put a lot of tiny transactions, that's going to push the miners towards filtering them. This balance is happening based on consensus and understanding where the limits are and not approaching them.
There are two things here. Obviously, this is a longer conversation, and I think we're probably going to wind up continuing this on the next episode when we're talking about microtransactions. But, I mean, that's kind of what this comes to. Microtransactions wind up being the baby that gets thrown out with the bathwater in this. Because we're concerned about these small transactions, it's very difficult to tell a small transaction from another small transaction. So if you're talking about a micropayment that's in the realm of, 0.01 Bitcoin or 0.005 Bitcoin or something like that, then I just don't see how there's any way to really differentiate between the two, since it's such a agnostic protocol.
At the moment, there isn't, and that's the problem, which is gradually finding ways to explicitly encode unspendable transaction, whose goal is to express data rather than payments, so that those are not taken as spendable transactions by the miners, and attach fees to them so that they can be processed properly like everything else. So in a way, this is really an interim thing. I think over the next 6 months, we're going to see some clarity and moving more clearly to a market approach. Right now, essentially, we've got the worst of both worlds. There is constraints on the limit of the block size, and there's no easy way to tell between actually payable transactions or non-spendable transactions, because you can't prove that they're not spendable.
Want to set up an online store that accepts Bitcoins? Go to openbitcoinstore.com and you can have a store up and running before the end of this message. Just enter your email address and the store name, and in less than 30 seconds, you'll have a secure WordPress e-commerce site up and running that accepts Bitcoins and pays you in cash within 24 hours. And best of all, it's completely free. Go to openbitcoinstore.com today and open for business now.
Let's Talk Bitcoin is heard each week by thousands of people who are participating in the new digital economy. Our listener base of Bitcoin owners, miners, investors, technologists, and merchants is growing fast. We offer a limited number of short advertising slots in each show to keep our listeners engaged and to provide maximum impact for our sponsors. If you'd like to talk to us about Let's Talk Bitcoin, send us an email at sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com. So this morning I'm joined by Bailey Reitzel with Payment Source and Mark Hochstein with American Banker. Over the last couple of weeks, there have been some interesting developments on the exchange side of things, and specifically with Mt. Gox and this ongoing Dwolla issue, where there's been some tension between the Department of Homeland Security and one of the payment processors that Mt. Gox uses as its primary onboarding mechanic for getting American users into their Japanese system. I was wondering, from your perspective, what's going on here and where do you think it's going?
This was the first major regulatory action that we saw against a company in the Bitcoin world. I think people were bracing for it, expecting it to come sooner or later. It's going to be interesting to see how Mt. Gox defends its position. Interestingly, it all comes down to the definition of what is a money transmitter and what is a money services business. The FinCEN guidelines that came out a couple months ago indicated that they expected certain businesses that are involved in virtual currency, and they didn't specifically mention Bitcoin at the time, but they said that they expected these companies to comply with the registration requirements for MSBs and in many cases with the money transmitter requirements, which are even more stringent than the MSB registration. And it seems that the government has decided that Mt. Gox is a money transmitter. And I know a lot of this, what I'm telling you is nothing you don't know, but they definitely came pretty fast and furious. In terms of freezing the accounts that Mt. Gox had here in the U.S. with Dwolla and at Wells Fargo, and the so-called smoking gun that they had when Mt. Gox or a subsidiary of Mt. Gox applied for an account with Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo asked them, "Are you a money transmitter?" And they answered no. And I suspect that there may be some interesting case at some point debating what is the definition and do they have any plausible deniability.
You're totally right. They did at one point say that they were not a money transmitter on one of their applications. But kind of an interesting thing from where I sit is that application actually was filled out in early 2011. So at the time...
Long before the FinCEN guidelines came out, right?
Right, exactly. So it seems like when these regulatory actions happen in almost a retroactive fashion, how can businesses really be expected to comply with that? Do you think that that's a fair standard?
I think they might have a case with that. The FinCEN guidelines, when they came out a couple months ago, said that they were clarifying guidelines. So the subtext of that was, in case you had any doubts, yes, this does apply to businesses that fit these descriptions that traffic in virtual currencies. But again, I think that it may be an interesting defense that they could theoretically mount. You told us after the fact that we were definitely subject to this, and now you're freezing us. I don't think they got a warning. It wasn't like they got a cease and desist letter that says you have 30 days to get licensed as a money transmitter or we're shutting you down. I mean, it came pretty quickly. And now if they were a too big to fail bank, they might have gotten a little bit gentler treatment. But I think as a lot of money services businesses, not just in the Bitcoin world, have learned, justice is pretty swift and harsh if you're a small operation, and if you're HSBC or a large global institution like that, you get kid gloves.
I think this shows the growing attention that's being put on Bitcoin, and these businesses are really going to have to pay attention to the guidelines and whatnot. At the Bitcoin conference, somebody in the legal realm was talking about how Western Union was really looking at Bitcoin too. So we're just seeing a lot of these legacy systems start paying attention because Bitcoin has the opportunity to really disrupt those industries.
At the Bitcoin conference, again, you're there kind of representing, you write for Payment Source, which talks more about conventional banking and things like that. What was kind of your take on Bitcoin? Do you think that it represents, a threat? I mean, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What's your read at this point?
Bitcoin definitely poses a threat to certain areas right now. I know they were talking about this micropayments, so you can pay per article instead of for subscriptions. Charitable giving is another one that they talked about. And then international remittance was a really big deal as well. So like I said, Western Union and some of these other wire transfers, Bitcoin definitely poses a threat to them, but supposedly they're on it. So will they work with Bitcoin or how will they work with Bitcoin, I guess, is what we need to think about now.
In the bigger picture, Adam, all these things could be complementary. When people talk about competition does not always have to mean winner take all. Pencils and pens compete with each other in some sense, but there are some types of writing that you might choose to do with a pencil, and there's some types of writing you might choose to do with a pen. Bitcoin's an alternative. It could siphon off some transaction volume, but it doesn't mean, knocking the other thing out of the box necessarily. Something that I always like to talk about when we talk about it going to a cashless society, there are certain transactions today that I like to pay for with my credit card because, even though I pay it off the credit card at the end of every month, I like to get the rewards. I like the fraud protection. So there is some value to that. But there are other transactions that today I might choose to pay for with cash. And if cash goes away, I might want some other way to pay that is not necessarily tracked and traced and data mined, and that there needs to be some kind of an alternative as we go to digital payments, and Bitcoin has shown that that's possible.
You say that cryptocurrencies represent an alternative, and I think that I agree with that. But the part that I come back to, in the pencil pen argument, is that maybe that wouldn't be the case if all the world had ever known was pens. You know what I mean? It seems like that's true, but right now we have kind of a debt-based money system, and Bitcoin isn't debt-based. Bitcoin is asset-based. It's ownership-based. It just seems like it's very, very disruptive to a lot of existing systems beyond the ones that you happen to mention. I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
It definitely is an emerging competitor to PayPal and to some extent to Western Union, MoneyGram, businesses like that. There was a report that came out about a week ago by this company called FIS. They're a vendor of banking technology, the core systems that banks run. They're one of the big providers of that. And they did this whole sort of focus group study about real-time payments. And they did all these sort of polling and research to make a business case that consumers want real-time payments, and that they would consider this extremely valuable. And I read that, and I thought it's kind of silly that in the world that we live in today, where I can send you an email and you'll get it almost instantaneously, that it's considered sort of a goal or a reach for the banking system to enable real-time person-to-person payments or account-to-account transfers or real-time remittances. How hard could it possibly be? And if you built the banking system from scratch today, it would look more like Bitcoin than the patchwork that we have. And so, it shows what banking could be like if you didn't have so many legacy systems. Regulation is also a factor. I mean, I don't want to be disingenuous. I think that part of the issue that banks face is they have AML and KYC requirements. That adds cost and that adds friction. Satoshi didn't ask for any licenses or permissions when he designed Bitcoin. He just kind of went ahead and did it, left it to the users to figure out how to integrate that into the real world.
It's definitely really beneficial for merchants. The currency stabilizes. It's going to be a cheaper system if, like Mark said, we can keep the cost down. But with the current regulations, I'm not sure that that's going to be possible, because these businesses are going to have to start getting state licenses, which is a pretty big expense. But you also have the no chargeback thing, which for merchants looks very attractive. So hopefully we can do that, and it'll be a big threat. But the regulation right now is we're going to really have to talk to the regulators, I think, and the Bitcoiners are actually going to have to go out and make that happen and not wait for the government to ask them.
Erik Voorhees is one of the names out there in the Bitcoin community who is basically saying that it is a bad idea and asking for trouble to operate any kind of Bitcoin-based business out of the U.S. On one side of it, there's that. On the other side of it, as you're talking about, with the regulations and the state-by-state licenses, some states, such as Texas, have essentially said that anyone who does business with anyone living in Texas, whether or not you have a nexus, as they call them, within the state, must comply with, have all the licenses, and follow all of the rules as if they were in the state. Do you think that there is a place for Bitcoin-based businesses to be operated out of the United States, or do you think that we'll see more of an exodus as we move?
I would just say that I think there's a lot more states than just Texas. Most of the states that you have to get licenses in, even if you're outside of the U.S. So that's just something that's going to happen either way.
I think it's going to be hard. I think it is definitely going to be hard for Bitcoin-related businesses. Erik worked at BitInstant, and they saw the writing on the wall in the sense that they did register as an MSB a long time ago, like more than a year ago, I think. They registered as an MSB. They just, and it wasn't necessarily that they were being goody-goodies. People don't want to go to jail. That's a very reasonable motivation. I think it's going to get harder, and I think you are seeing ripple effects from the regulation through the banking system. I know of at least one Bitcoin entrepreneur who had to put some plans on hold because his bank got freaked out. Not that it wasn't based necessarily on logic or reason or pointing to something specific in the regulations. It was the Mt. Gox seizure news broke, and the bank that previously had made a commitment to work with him just said, we're not doing this, and the guy has to start from scratch again. So, there's these sort of indirect effects that are coming from the regulation. It's going to be hard. It's going to be really interesting to watch. I don't know whether There has to be an exodus, but I wouldn't be surprised if some entrepreneurs sought more welcoming jurisdictions.
It goes with the Bitfloor thing too with Roman. You know, his account got shut down at Capital One, and likely because they're looking at him as risky money transmitter business, which, I mean, even outside of the Bitcoin space, like those accounts get shut down quite frequently. But so he's having to deal with like getting the check back from the bank and then finding another bank to open an account so he can get that money back to his users before, which is going to be quite difficult for him. So it's just, yeah, I think the U.S. regulations and the banking system right now looking at Bitcoin businesses, it's going to be a struggle for Bitcoin businesses.
Now, one thing that jumped out at me about the Mt. Gox issue was that the action was actually taken by the Department of Homeland Security. I had been under the impression that this was not generally an area that they were involved in. So, again, from your perspective, is this a normal action? Should it have come from a different agency? Is it surprising to you at all, or am I just making something out of nothing?
I was surprised. I'm not an expert in all the legal issues here, but I was a little bit surprised, because I think when I think of Department of Homeland Security, I think of, stopping like ticking time bombs or whatever. Maybe this does fall under their portfolio, but FinCEN would have been the agency I would have expected to take action. But, and of course, it doesn't really help in terms of optics that it's Department of Homeland Security, right? I mean,
certainly,
if, the knock on cryptocurrencies is that, they facilitate money laundering, then, even if this was under the jurisdiction of DHS, it just sort of has all these insinuations that may not be fair. The crime that allegedly was committed by Mt. Gox was operating as a unlicensed money transmitter. So there's, I've seen no evidence that there were, that any nefarious characters or truly nefarious characters were using Mt. Gox to launder money. It was more just a violation of the requirement to, file the right paperwork and pay the fees and whatnot. But when you have DHS involved, that just sort of, that name just has certain associations with it.
Where do you think that this cryptocurrency movement is going?
I think Bailey had to step out, by the way. From what she told me about the conference, there's still a lot of interest in it, definitely from the VC community. I think that dealing with the regulators is going to be a challenge. I think dealing and integrating with the banking system is going to be a challenge. But there's something that I always forget to note this whenever I talk about Bitcoin with people. But there's something that the cryptocurrency has going for it, that it's sort of subjective, but the energy and the enthusiasm around it in that community is really something. I have never heard of anyone talk about going to a Google Wallet meetup, right? How many PayPal user forums are there out there, aside from like people complaining about PayPal? There's a real sort of, and critics call it cultish. And I actually think that it's sort of very endearing. Like the people you meet, they're really into it. They believe they're changing the world. I don't know if they actually are changing the world, but they believe it and they're dedicated. And that counts for something. The other thing, when people talk about the value of cryptocurrency, if I handed you a poker chip and I said, Adam, this poker chip is really valuable, and you would laugh in my face, right? It's just a piece of plastic. But if I told you that this poker chip could sprout wings and fly anywhere in the world, probably instantaneously and, at tops 20 minutes, anywhere I said on command, and the person receiving it wouldn't even have to know it came from me, well, that has some value. We don't know exactly how much that's worth, but it's worth something. And so I think that as long as the exchange rate is, and it seems to have stabilized too. It's like over 100 now, right? I mean, it was like 112 last I checked.
Yeah, it's been floating around there.
Yeah, so it's, after the volatility a few weeks ago, it seems to have been fairly stable. But as long as this thing is worth more than a penny in terms of the exchange rate, then the protocol is useful. So, I don't know if it's going to just sort of stay as an underground thing or if it will get more mainstream, but it's going to be really interesting to watch. And I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but I do think it's going to have some kind of an impact. Everyone makes fun of me here because I talk about Bitcoin so much there in the office, and I've been into it for like a year now, but I just, I really admire that community. As far as whether Bitcoin can be compatible with banking, in a better world, it would be. I mean, in reality, no. In reality, I think there's going to be they're either going to really crack down on these businesses, or it's going to force some kind of a broader conversation about money and privacy. which is, the optimistic view is that, maybe like people will take a closer look at some of these money laundering laws. Say like, do we really need KYC at the very low end? I went to MoneyGram last year just to pay a bill, and I had an invoice number for the bill, right?
Right.
So I had the correct amount of money, correct amount of cash. I had the invoice number. So the recipient of the payment knows that it's the right bill. But MoneyGram still asks, and the recipient did not need my name or address.
Right, they don't care. They just care so long as it gets paid.
Right. But MoneyGram insisted that I give them my name and address. And I'm sure it's not because MoneyGram really cares. They're probably doing it, either they're explicitly required to do that under KYC, or they're trying to impress the regulators by going over and above, saying, look at all this data we're keeping. But either way, I mean, why do I have to have my name and address floating around in one more database?
And it kind of brings us back around to this big versus small is actually in reality different, but the way that our rules tend to work does not differentiate between those two. It's a very one-size-fits-all solution. Again, this is an area where because Bitcoin is so granular in its implementation, you can do very, very small payments very easily. You can do very, very large payments very easily. It seems like the large payment size is kind of already taken care of. We have systems where that already functions well, and it's, and the cost relative to the amount that's being transferred isn't that bad. But it's on that low end where these new cryptocurrencies really seem to be innovating by taking out a lot of this, frankly, headache. Do you think that the system could possibly develop in such a way so that smaller transactions or small, little stuff, small ball stuff is not under the same sort of requirements as the, know your customer KYC, and all of the other sort of regulatory burdens that the big banks kind of need to have from the perspective of government, but maybe don't make sense on the small ones?
It could be with like the local Bitcoin sellers, because there is an out in the FinCEN regulations. It says, you're subject to these requirements. You're a money transmitter or MSB if you do this, quote, as a business. So some of these local Bitcoin sellers, and I don't know how they define as a business, but like the meetup group that we go to, some of those people have bought or sold Bitcoins in the over-the-counter market. And that could be part of the solution, or because, if they keep under the radar and they just do little transactions here and there, it's not super efficient, but it's harder to control or shut down like Mt. Gox was. I mean, Mt. Gox was like the least Bitcoin-like aspect of the Bitcoin world, right? I mean, Bitcoin is decentralized, it's peer-to-peer, it's distributed, it's, and this is something actually you guys should talk about with your co-hosts, is that you could argue that it's an anti-fragile system.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with this concept. We've been talking about it for about a month now. Yeah, the more you punch it, the less damage it takes from each, punch that comes back.
Right. So I think like the little Bitcoin sellers could be part of the solution. It's not going to be a great way for like VCs to like, buy this stuff, or for like, institutional investors. But if I want to buy something from, and it's not super efficient either to go like meet someone at Starbucks, to get the payment. I mean, I think that'll be part of it. People who run little small businesses, if they just start accepting Bitcoins and getting paid in Bitcoins, you can't live on that except for that Forbes reporter. You can't. The privacy aspects of Bitcoin are what really drew it to me. The whole idea that you can do digital transactions and not be tracked and traced and cataloged if you don't want to be. I think that's very valuable, and I think that's valuable to people who are not necessarily criminals and terrorists. And that's what excites me, and the idea that you can bypass censorship. So, just because Joe Lieberman doesn't want you to send money to WikiLeaks, Bitcoin gives you a way to do it. That's what energizes me. Who knows? Maybe Frycoin is right. Maybe Frycoin is, that's the one that you like. If you don't spend it, you get taxed, right? There's something like that.
Yeah, that's the one that loses value over time, certainly.
In theory, I would entertain a cryptocurrency that was Keynesian or magic money tree cryptocurrency. I'm not saying that I agree with those theories either. I'm just agnostic about that. But like Bitcoin's out there. It's made a contribution already, just in terms of humanity, just because of those other aspects of it, regardless of whether they're right about inflation or deflation.
My theory is 6 months to 12 months from now, we're going to see congressional hearings where they pull in basically anybody they can find, to talk about this Bitcoin thing. And I'm curious, so do you think that that's an accurate time frame here based on how things are looking, or do you have a guess?
I'd say 6 months sounds about right. To the extent that banks are paying attention to Bitcoin, they probably feel threatened at the margins. I'm sure they would all say like, oh, well, we have to invest in all this like compliance, so why don't these other newcomers have to do it?
Again, with all these things, it's kind of like fighting back the tide to a certain extent. Even as an observer standing way back, you can kind of see the direction that things are going in, and so, you can fight that, but that's still the direction that things are going in.
I like to make the analogy to Uber.
Okay.
Uber, is sort of the startup that, shoots first and asks questions later.
Right.
And they run into resistance in a lot of the cities they go into. They insist everything they're doing is legal, but they get a lot of challenges. But they create facts on the ground. I hate that expression, by the way, but I can't think of a better way to say it, is that they go in, they start their business, they get customers who like them, and then, and then they figure out the regulatory stuff. I wonder if that's the way to go for disruptors in the financial services industry, and I don't know what the right answer is. But contrast that. Have you ever heard of Aaron Greenspan?
Aaron Greenspan? No, I don't believe so.
No. Aaron Greenspan, he had a company called Face Cash out in California. It was some kind of a innovative payments idea he had. He basically put $1 million into this thing, and he never got his business off the ground because there was a money transmitter law passed in California in like 2010 that was lobbied for by American Express, Western Union, etc., that basically gave the state regulator discretion as to how much of a bond that a new licensee had to put up. And this guy could never get a straight answer from the California regulator as to how much money he was supposed to have or how much capital he was supposed to have.
Right.
And he was never able to start his business. He sued the state, he sued a lot of people. It's kind of a sad story, but he was an example. You could point to him as an example of, here's a guy who tried to play by the rules and asked for permission and did everything he was quote unquote supposed to do, and he got hosed.
Yeah.
As opposed to Uber or Airbnb, they start up and they get customers and they do business, and then later on they're like, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to apply for a license, you know. And what's the right answer? I don't know. And I don't want to advise anyone to go test the limit. I couldn't have it on my conscience if they ended up in a bad situation. But at the same time, I see the case for that. The
results speak for themselves to a certain point. So I have an unrelated question. We're in the process of turning Let's Talk Bitcoin into a formal journalistic organization. We're at this conference making these decisions, and I come back and I see that this kind of major scandal has broken about government wiretaps and subpoenas and lawsuits, essentially going after journalists for being journalists. I've been watching this space for a long time, and I've actually never seen anything like this in my lifetime. I'm only 28. The kind of biggest reference point that people can give me is that this is what happened during the Nixon administration. This seems like it's an important development to me, and I'm curious if you also think that. I think a lot of journalists, particularly if they're reporting on sensitive topics like national security, are going to have to learn more about crypto. Been dabbling with this stuff for about a year, but it's mostly been sort of like theoretical. Like, I don't like the idea that the NSA could be listening. By the way, if the NSA is listening, peace be upon you. Just on the abstract level, but it's sort of becoming like more palpable. So I think that journalists, in fact, this is sort of the topic of the panel I'm going to do at the New York conference. Not so much Bitcoin with journalists, although that's part of it. VPNs and Tor and Jitsi, start making use of those tools. Know the limitations of them, because none of them are guaranteed to be 100% foolproof. But again, that's not a reason not to use it. You can put a kryptonite lock on your bike, and there's still a chance that someone will use Freon to smash it, but it's better than just leaving your bike on the street with no lock, right? Yeah. So yeah, it's horrible. It's completely f***ed up. And I used to make fun of Tea Partiers, and I still reserve the right to make fun of Tea Partiers, but they look a lot more credible now. If the IRS was profiling groups to scrutinize because they had Patriot or Tea Party or Liberty in their name, maybe they have a point, when they talk about this stuff. It's not encouraging. It is not good. And that's why WikiLeaks is an important part of the Bitcoin story that gets overlooked too much. Say what you will about WikiLeaks. Julian Assange is kind of a but they were a journalistic whistleblower organization that some politician decided
extra legally put pressure on the big payment networks to stop sending payments to. It's PayPal's business if they want to send money to someone or not. It's their company. But there ought to be some alternative way to get money around. So that's why Bitcoin's an important alternative, because it can't be controlled.
There's a directionality that we're moving in, and it's not one that involves more freedom for people and less scrutiny for people. This is kind of all done under the auspices of protecting citizens against criminals. Very broad strokes, obviously. This is a bad direction, and it's, and the actions that are being taken, like the journalistic thing, because journalistic organizations haven't really been doing their job when it comes to covering political issues for quite some time now. That's actually not a new thing, and I don't think many people are surprised about that at this point. What is surprising is that now the structure that they've been representing and apologizing for and presenting the case for is turning on them. And to me, that says that something is very wrong with not just the system, but that something is so wrong that it's requiring almost a cannibalization of the existing control mechanisms. So again, this can be on or off the record as you like it, but I'm very curious if I'm reading this wrong.
That's a big question.
It is, yes. And like I said, I'm genuinely curious myself, because I'm looking at this situation and going, man, I'm starting a journalistic organization at a time when journalism is functionally being outlawed, and I'm doing it about a topic that invalidates a lot of the existing power structures because it takes out all of the profit.
The pendulum can swing the other way. I mean, now that the AP thing has broken, they're making a stink about it, one would hope that, that would provoke sufficient outrage that there's some pushback. I don't think it's the apocalypse, but it's just bad, and it does not reflect well on this administration. It does not reflect well on his party, which I was raised to believe that was the party of civil liberties. But shows you how much attention I was paying. I mean, there is generally like a growing mistrust of institutions, whether it be government, the media, the banks.
For me, it's about centralization. I mean, really,
Yeah, I mean, I think that the peer-to-peer thing is a very strong case for it. It's a big philosophical question. But yeah, I mean, you definitely have a good point. But, the media is becoming more and more diffuse on its own. The big media outlets, they're all struggling. American bankers got a niche. So we're doing okay.
Right.
We've actually been doing pretty well, I think.
Right, and you have financially sensitive, again, I agree with you. I think that the niche that you've approached is good. And again, it almost speaks to that idea that the smaller that you get, the more valuable that you are. And right. The inverse of that is also true. The larger you get, the less relative value you offer to each individual, because you have to accommodate more individuals in your perspective.
Yeah. The funny thing is that we are actually the oldest financial newspaper in the country.
I didn't realize that.
I'll leave you with this. We were founded in 1836 when every bank issued its own currency and there was no national currency. And the original mission of what was originally called Thompson's Banknote Reporter was to sort of differentiate between the banknotes that were for real and the banknotes that were bullshit. So, he would expose counterfeits. John Thompson would expose banks that shin plasters was the term he used. He would send his sons around town in New York, and they would go to different banks with their banknotes and say, here's $1 that you've issued. Can you give us $1 worth of gold? And the ones that could produce the gold coins would get good ratings in Thompson's Banknote Reporter, and the ones that couldn't, he would savage them. So our heritage kind of ties back to all the stuff we've been talking. He was a character. He was a practitioner as well as a journalist. He founded one of the banks that is now part of either Citibank or Chase, I forget which, and his sons were bankers too. But he was a wild character.
Mark Hochstein, American banker. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
I may have gotten some of these technical details not quite right. So I will absolutely welcome people's responses and be corrected. And in fact, it would be great to have some of the developers intimately involved in these decisions and who understand the balance and compromises and trade-offs more clearly talk about this and perhaps come on the show and be interviewed. But the bottom line, the principle I want to really focus on is the principle of neutrality. It's basically recognizing that we have no idea what Bitcoin will be as a platform and what applications will be enabled. we have barely scratched the surface. And in terms of the internet history, we are at the point of enabling email, which was on the internet in the 70s. From there until you get to Facebook, there's a lot of evolution that happens, and none of it was foreseeable back in the 70s. So let's not make a network that can only do email. That's the basic concept here. Neutrality will help us build the next layer of applications, and above that, the next, and so on.
I think that that's really a great point to emphasize, is just that we don't know what's going to happen, is that, you know, we've got this thing that obviously has potential, and there could be so many things that could come on top of it, but the applications that are going to be the really revolutionary ones that change everything, we have no idea what they look like. So yeah, I mean, just reserving those decisions. I mean, if this decision should be made, it shouldn't be made at this point. It needs to be made further down the line when we've seen some of this growth that comes on top of it, and we can say, okay, well, these are the things that have worked, and these are the things that clearly do not work. And then, you know, but even so, the point is that the decision being made now is a decision made in ignorance, and it's always a poor choice to do that.
You're much more likely to get the decision wrong at this point. Our planning horizon is much shorter than our innovation horizon, so essentially you're steering blind if you make decisions like that now. The key here for me is neutrality is not a lack of principles. Neutrality is a principle in itself. I think it's the most important principle in Bitcoin, the one that gives it all its power.
Thanks for tuning into episode 13 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Whether you liked, loved, or hated the show, we want to know what you think. Please send all comments, questions, and offers to help to mail@letstalkbitcoin.com. Thanks to Andreas M. Antonopoulos, Dr. Stephanie Murphy, Thomas O'Brien, Michael Megan, Chris Odom, Charles Hoskinson, Mark Hochstein, and Bailey Reitzel for providing content for this episode. Music for this episode was provided by Jared Rubens. For more information about the music we use and the open source artists who create it, please visit www.letstalkbitcoin.com/music. Stay tuned for episode 14 coming up on Friday the 7th of June, featuring an interview with Peter, the lead developer of Feathercoin, and Zach, one of the minds behind the Bitcoin vending machines coming to a future near you. As always, you can find our episode-specific tip jars and other support means at www.letstalkbitcoin.com. Thanks for listening.